Okay, good morning. This is Jennifer Zigmant with the Wyoming DEQ. We're right at 10 o'clock and we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining as we get going. Thank you for joining the webinar. This is the Non-Point Source Program Grants Application Training webinar. On the Google Meet screen, you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation that I'll be going through today. Just a reminder, you can use your computer audio, or you can also call in using that phone number and using that 6-digit PIN there. If you have any questions or you're running into any issues, please let us know through the chat function and we'll try to troubleshoot as best as we can. But let's go ahead and jump into it. So again, this is the grants application training associated with the FY19, Section 319 and 205J request for proposals. So this is the RFP that went out last week on the 10th. And this is for grant funding that will be available in the spring and summer of 2019. Again, my name is Jennifer Zigmant. I am the Non-Point Source Program Coordinator with the Water Quality Division here at DEQ. My contact information is up there on the screen. Feel free to give me a call or an email with questions after the webinar. So, a few housekeeping items before we get going. Please, if you're not speaking, mute your phone or your computer audio. We are going to be using the Google Meet chat functions to send in questions today. I've got my colleague Stephanie Gertkin in the room here. She's going to help field those questions as they come in. On your Google Meet screen, you should have these tabs at the top, one for people, one for chat. If you click on that chat tab, you will see this menu here. You can type in a message to everybody in the bottom of the screen there, and Stephanie will track questions that way. If we have time at the end, I can open up the phone lines for questions, but sometimes that gets a little difficult with a lot of people on the line. If I don't get to all questions during the webinar, I will post answers to any remaining questions afterwards on our website. And if you have any feedback after the webinar, feel free to send it to me at my email address there. Finally, just a disclaimer that this webinar is being recorded. The plan is to record it and then post it on the website after today's event. So if you know people who weren't able to join, they're welcome to look at it on the website there. So the purpose of this webinar today, again, is to provide information for anyone interested in submitting a proposal for the FY19, 319, and 205J grant funds. And it's also secondarily an opportunity to provide, the purpose is to provide an opportunity for questions and answers. For those of you familiar with my program in the past, I have done that pre-review opportunity for draft proposals or sections of proposals. I won't be doing that in 2019. So the intent of today's webinar is really to give everybody the same grants training. Questions after today's webinar should be limited to technical questions, procedural questions, but I won't be able to do any kind of pre-review opportunity on a draft proposal or sections of proposals. So please feel free to get any questions out today, and then after today's webinar, I can answer questions again related to procedures, but not to content. So what we will cover today, first I'll give an overview of the 319 and 205J grants. We'll talk about what information is now required in the proposal, and there have been some significant changes. We'll go over how to submit a proposal. I'll give you some tips for how to submit a competitive proposal, and then we'll talk about application process and timelines. So to begin with, what grants are we talking about? We've got two grants that we manage through the DEQ Non-Point Source Program. Both of them are federal grants that get awarded to the states under the Clean Water Act, funding provided to the states to address non-point source pollution. Non-point source pollution, I think, just looking at the attendees, everybody's probably familiar with what we're talking about here, but we're talking about unregulated pollution that occurs when there's surface runoff from rain events, snow melt, anything that is not regulated through a permit or some other kind of regulatory mechanism. The first grant that we have is the Section 319 grant. Section 319 just refers to the section in the Clean Water Act that authorizes that funding to states. And that's kind of our Big Deal Charlie grant. That's the most money that we have, the intent of which is to go out on the ground and do projects that will reduce non-point source pollution to protect our surface water and our groundwater. The smaller grant is the Section 205J grant. Again, 205J just refers to the section of the Clean Water Act. It's actually two sections, 205J and 604B, so you might hear these referred to as 604B grants as well. Same thing. This is a smaller grant that's intended for planning purposes only. We can't do on-the-ground work with it, but it is a good funding source for those planning, monitoring, assessment, feasibility kind of studies. So where can I find proposal information? All of the grant application material is posted on my non-point source program website through the DEQ, specifically on the grants resources website. There's a direct link there, or if you have the non-point source program website bookmarked, if you look under program resources, the third one down, click grant resources, it'll bring up a page with some preliminary information and then a downloads table where you can access all of the documents to submit an application. For each grant, there is a separate memorandum and an application form, two main documents. Make sure that you read through the memorandum. That announces the RFP, it provides guidance, and it provides detailed instructions that you'll need to complete the application form. So please don't skip through the memorandum. Very helpful to read through it. We'll go through a lot of what's in the memorandum today, but I still recommend that you give that a read through. And then secondly, for each grant, there is a separate application form. So make sure you fill out the correct application form. There's one for 319 and one for 205J. And for FY19, we have overhauled the application materials. They have been shortened and streamlined. We're at a point in the program where we're getting enough applications each year. It's been getting more and more competitive each year that with approval from the non-point source task force, they really felt like it was time to shorten our application and streamline it a bit this year. So if you pull it up, you'll see a much shorter application, and we'll go over some of those major changes in this webinar today. So in addition to the memorandum for each grant and the application form, for Section 319 projects, please take a look at some other information posted on that website. First, you might need to look up some sage-grouse core area data. There's a link to the Game and Fish website page for you to do that. We'll talk a little bit about watershed-based planning and the 9 key elements. There's a handout posted on the website that summarizes those elements. There's also a table that summarizes what watershed-based plans we have in Wyoming. And then finally, those last two bullet items are if you want to better understand how the task force will review your proposal, there's the 319 evaluation and scoring sheet, and also further proposal review guidelines for the task force. We'll go into those in a little bit more detail, but please take a look at those. That'll really help you understand how your proposal will be evaluated. The general timeline. So the RFP was issued on July 10th. Today is the training webinar, obviously. The big deal date is September 14th. That's when the final proposals are due. I won't be able to accept any proposals after that date, for any reason, and that's something that the task force has made very clear, that it is an absolute deadline. So please be sure to get your proposals in by 5 p.m. on September 14th. After that, in the middle of September and early October, I'll review the proposals. I'll send them to the task force for review. And then the middle of October to early November, we haven't set a date yet, but that's when we'll host the non-point source task force meeting for the fall. People that have submitted a proposal will have the opportunity to come present to the task force, and then the task force will make funding recommendations at that meeting. If you are recommended for funding, then just please note that funding won't actually be available until the spring or summer of 2019. So there is a lag time between when you're recommended for funding and when we actually award the funding. And just another disclaimer that I just want to make sure people are aware of. The amount of funding that we get and when we can release those funds is ultimately dependent on congressional and presidential federal budget approval. Again, these are federal funds, so we're kind of in a play it by ear situation year to year in terms of what our actual allocation will be and when that gets released. If there's any significant updates to the federal budget that causes us to change the plan with this RFP or submitting a proposal, I will send out those updates via the non-point source listserv. So if you're not already registered for that, please register for that, and you'll be sure to get updates that way. Okay, so I'll stop there and open it up for any questions. It doesn't look like anything's come in via the chat function. So I will, since I think we're doing fine on time, throw it out there for anybody on the line. If you want to ask a question now, feel free to unmute your phone or your computer audio and throw out any questions you have. I will mention that I am kind of a grammar nerd, so posted a few funny grammar errors throughout the presentation, but you will, I will appreciate it if proposals are thoroughly proofread and you look for any grammar issues. So any questions? Okay, hearing none, we'll keep going on. So Section 319 proposals, let's go into this in a little bit more detail. Section 319 grants, again, this is our bigger grant, the purpose of which is to reduce non-point source pollution to protect or improve water quality. They are reimbursement grants only, so meaning we can't pay in advance for work that's done, we can only reimburse you after work has been completed. For 319 grants, at least 40% of the total project cost must be non-federal match. In terms of eligibility for 319 projects, again, any projects that demonstrate the real potential to improve water quality by reducing non-point source pollution are eligible. That's very broad. We have program priorities within that large universe, and I'll go over those in a minute, but there's a wide range of project categories that are eligible. Watershed restoration, which would be on-the-ground projects to restore impaired water bodies. Watershed protection projects, which would be on-the-ground work to improve unimpaired water bodies or protect high-quality water bodies. Outreach education projects, monitoring and assessment, planning, technical assistance, and groundwater projects are all eligible. So again, that's pretty broad. We'll talk about program priorities within that scope in the next few slides. What we can't fund through 319, we can't fund anything that's strictly research. We can't fund anything that's a regulatory action or permitted point sources. We can't fund projects where the primary benefit is increased production, such as agricultural production. That can be a secondary benefit, but the primary benefit has to be water quality. We can't purchase real estate, and obviously we can't do anything that would violate local, state, or federal regulation. So, who can apply for Section 319 funds? Again, the eligibility here is very broad. Pretty much anybody can apply. The only limitation is if we made an award to an individual, that project would be limited to a demonstration project only. I think it'd be very rare that we would do that, but basically anybody is eligible to apply. The graph on the screen there, just for context, shows our project from 1999 through 2017 by sponsor type. We've worked with conservation districts, nonprofit organizations, cities, counties, federal agencies, state agencies, a wide variety of people. One of the questions that I get most often is, well, how much funding is available and how much should I apply for? And again, that's not always a straightforward question to answer, again, because these are federal funds and the budget changes year to year. I estimate for FY19 that a maximum of $875,000 could be available for projects. Oh, hang on. I'm sorry, I just had a note. Can somebody tell me if they can or cannot hear me? You can't hear me. Okay, great. I had a notice come up that my mic was turned off and I just wanted to check. Okay, perfect. Thank you guys. Okay. So again, in FY19, I'm estimating that the maximum amount we could get would be $875,000. It could be more, it could be less. That's the amount that we received in FY18. That's where I generally start when I estimate going into next year's budget. In terms of how much to apply for, there's no maximum project amount cap. In previous years, we've limited people to a maximum of $400,000 per project. I've removed that cap this year. But for context, last year, the funding awards ranged from $25,000 to $180,000. Again, that's just for context, that's not set in stone. My recommendation is to apply for what you need, request the amount of money that you need, but be as cost effective as possible. Again, we are seeing more projects than we have in the past. The competition has increased, so we're not seeing as large dollar projects as we have, say, 5 years ago. And it's always a good practice when you come in with your proposal, apply for what you need, but be ready to describe how you would phase your project if we're only able to award you partial funding. So let's talk a little bit more about the priorities for Section 319 funds. So as I mentioned a couple slides ago, pretty much any project that improves water quality by reducing non-point source pollution is potentially eligible. But we do have high, medium, and low priority projects, and this is outlined in the RFP. We place the highest priority on watershed restoration projects. Again, those are projects that implement on-the-ground conservation practices to restore impaired water bodies. This is based on partly state priorities, but also national requirements for the 319 grant that require that we focus the bulk of our funding to improving our impaired surface water bodies. Note that for these watershed restoration projects, a 9-element watershed-based plan or alternative plan is required. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Our medium priority projects would be our watershed protection projects. These are on-the-ground projects that implement conservation practices to protect unimpaired water bodies or protect a high-quality water body. In those cases, either a watershed-based plan or an alternative plan is also required. And then our lowest priority projects is basically anything other than watershed restoration or watershed protection projects. So outreach and education, monitoring and assessment, planning, technical assistance, and groundwater projects are low priority, which is not to say that they won't get funded, but I would be very cost effective if you are proposing a project that falls within that low priority category. Generally, I would recommend that you limit those projects to $50,000 or less. And for these low priority projects, you do not need any kind of watershed-based plan or alternative plan to apply for those projects. So let's talk about watershed-based planning a little bit more. Those of you familiar with the project have probably heard this, but let me give you an overview. So again, we have what we call nine-element watershed-based plans that pertain to the 319 program. This is again based on national requirements for our grant administration. If we're putting money on the ground for a watershed restoration project, we're looking for a watershed-based plan to basically give us confidence that we know that the money that we're investing in that watershed is in fact going to address the problem. Watershed planning can get confusing. Everybody has their own name for different kinds of planning. And again, the 9 key elements that have been established for 319 really, in its simplest terms, is just what is your roadmap for how you're going to fix the problem? Where are you? Where are you trying to go? What is the problem? How are you going to fix it? So the 9 key elements just establish certain planning requirements that have to be in a watershed-based plan in order for it to be approved by the DEQ and ultimately for EPA to release the funds for those projects. The 9-element watershed plan can take many forms. It can be a watershed-based plan that's written, say, by a conservation district on their own. It can be a TMDL implementation plan. It could be a TMDL plus some other planning documents. There's many ways that you can get to that point where you've got a 9-element plan. Again, the main point is just to have, to the best of your knowledge, a good roadmap of where you are and where you're trying to get to. There is more information on the website. If you're not familiar with this, please take a look at that 9 key element summary that outlines the specific elements. And then there also is a PDF doc posted that shows for our impaired water bodies whether or not we've got a watershed-based plan. But bottom line here, please give me a call if you're not sure whether there's an applicable watershed-based plan for your project or not. I'm happy to talk that through with you. I'd rather you ask me that question up front rather than submit a proposal and run into that eligibility criteria down the road. So I did mention alternative plans as well. Again, the 319 national guidance for how we can administer the grants requires that in most cases, we need the 9-element watershed-based plan before we can put money on the ground for fixing impaired water bodies. In very limited cases, I can make a case that an alternative plan may be accepted. And this could be, for example, in an emergency situation or in a very small scale watershed where the source of the problem is absolutely known. So these situations are probably going to be rare, but if you have a situation where it's either some kind of emergency situation, say an emergency situation to public health, or you've got a small watershed where you know all you need to do is go out and fix 5 septic systems, we can probably make a case for an alternative plan. But if we're talking watershed-wide, multiple sources, then we will need that 9-element plan. For watershed protection projects, which is again, on the ground work to protect an unimpaired water body, at a minimum, you would need what's required in an alternative plan. The required information in an alternative plan is that you need to identify the causes and the sources of the water quality problem. You need to identify the goals and how the project will make progress towards those goals. You'll need to outline a schedule and milestones. You'll need to describe what your proposed management measures are. In other words, your BMPs, your conservation practices, the activities you want to do. And then finally, you'll need to have a monitoring component. So those are the 5 things that you'll need at a minimum for an alternative plan. That alternative plan doesn't have to be a separate document. You could refer to other planning documents such as a level 1 study, a local watershed plan, other planning documents that are out there. It doesn't have to be in a separate document called alternative plan. So bottom line here again, if you think an alternative plan applies to your project, don't hesitate to give me a call. This is one area where I really would want to discuss this with you before you invest a lot of time into a proposal and then we run into complications down the road. So what do you need to submit for a 319 proposal? Basically 3 things at most. The application form, 1 or more project maps, and then if applicable, a sage-grouse core area consultation letter from the Game and Fish. And I'll describe that in a few more slides, whether or not that's applicable. But note, I'm not asking for any other attachments this year. The Excel budget workbook that I required in the past is not required this year. And the task force is also requesting no letters of support. So in your proposal, you'll want to describe partnerships, but you do not need to get letters of support this year. Just as a disclaimer, so kind of the only downside to having a shortened application form is that if you are recommended for funding, at that point, I will work with you to put together a more detailed project implementation plan and budget justification. So in the past, the longer application form and budget justification really automatically became your project implementation plan and budget justification. This year, with a shortened application form, if you are recommended for funding, we will have to work to put together those more detailed documents. So just a heads up there on that disclaimer. So let's talk about the 319 application form itself. It is a 9-page fillable PDF form. Please do not modify the format. The sections are limited in length on purpose. Please use Adobe Reader. If you don't have that, it is a free download. Make sure you download it and save it to a location on your computer first. After that, you can edit and save the document. If you just open it and start typing in it, you can't save it. So please download it first to your computer, then open it, edit it, and save it. If you're on a Mac, please make sure that you download Adobe and open it with Adobe, not Preview, which is kind of the default PDF reader on Macs. If you open it with Preview, you might lose some of the functionality. So the next few slides show some screenshots from the application form. I don't think the resolution is that great on the screen, so please make, if you want to read through the language in detail, you can download it from the website. But I do want to go over a few of the fields and give you some tips on how to complete them. So on this first page, starting with the project title, I know it sounds silly, but be brief. If you are recommended for funding, you're going to have to write your title probably hundreds of times. Sometimes I get titles that are really, really long. So just think about how to accurately, descriptively describe your project, but do keep it brief. The project synopsis. This is where if somebody was only going to read one thing about your project, what would you want them to know? In 1 to 5 sentences, put in here using a popular non-technical writing style. What is your project about? What's the problem and what are you going to do to fix it? I will use this information, probably just copy and paste it into some program reports and some outreach material. So really think about how you would want to present your project to the public in simple terms. Applicant information, I think, is pretty straightforward. I just want to make sure it's clear that the applicant is the entity who we, the DEQ, will enter into a legal agreement with. So this is the person that will be responsible for all of the grant administration activities. Project location, I think, is pretty straightforward. If you need help finding watershed names or hydrologic unit code numbers, you can use the EPA Surf Your Watershed tool, or you're welcome to give me a call as well. I'm happy to help you look that up. Impaired water bodies, I think based on who's on the call, most people are probably familiar with water quality impairments. You can see the memorandum for more information if you're not, and or give me a call if you have any question about what we're talking about with water quality impairments and where to find the current impaired waters list. Project map. You'll want to provide at least one project map. You can submit multiple maps if you want to. That provides information to show where your project's located in the state and what are the major geospatial factors that you would help explain your project. Again, show relevant information. You don't need to put more detail isn't necessarily better, but just put the information on there that would help me and my board members understand your project. You can have multiple maps again, but please limit them to the 8.5 by 11 page size, normal page size. One of the comments, or one of the things that I have seen in the past, is people will send me a fantastic map of a very detailed view of the project, but it doesn't show where in Wyoming that project is located. So it can be a really good map, but if my board members don't have a context of where in Wyoming it is, it doesn't help them out much. So make sure that you do give them context for where in the state it is. The board members come from all parts of the state, so they may be familiar with your project area. They may have no idea where it's at. So don't forget to clarify that. Okay, next page. I think the project type, pollutant sources, pollutants addressed checkboxes are pretty straightforward. This just puts your project in some broad categories that I then use for data entry down the road. Project timeframe, put the start date when you ideally would like to begin your project, and then put the end date when you think your project will be completed. Again, note that funds will not be available until the spring or summer of 2019, and projects for 319 would have to be completed by December 2023. So about 4 years to complete your project maximum. Project purpose. This is probably one of the most important sections, and when I was doing the pre-review opportunity, this is where I most often had comments. People kind of jump to the technical aspects of their proposal, and they forget to really emphasize why their project is important and why it should be funding. And here again, speak in terms that are understandable to the general public, meaning that the problem isn't that the water body's on the impaired waters 303D list. The problem is that it's got too much of a certain pollutant and it's not supporting fisheries, or it's not supporting drinking water uses, or it's not supporting recreation. Again, make that connection to why your project's important in terms that would be understandable to the general citizen. Next page, project scope. Here's where one of the areas where the application has been very streamlined from previous years. In the past, we had the task table, and I had people outline goals and objectives and targets. Much simpler this year. In that section, just provide a narrative on what you will do to address the water quality problem that you identified in the previous section. And be specific. What specific activities will you complete to reach that goal? Rather than saying, we're going to do some grazing BMPs, what exactly are you going to do? Are you going to do fencing? Are you going to do off-channel watering? Are you going to do some grazing management plans? If you're fixing septic tanks, how many are you going to do? How are you going to prioritize or go out there and look for septic projects to complete? Be specific, but don't get hung up on terms like I've had in the past about objectives and targets and tasks. Just tell us what you're going to do. And again, project plans, this gets back to the previous slides about watershed-based planning. Please refer back to those slides and or the memorandum and the additional information posted on the website. Here, just describe what is your roadmap. Again, what is your plan to get from point A to point B? How do you know what you're going to do will be effective? Here again, if you have any questions about a 9-element plan or alternative plans, please don't hesitate to give me a shout. Next page, project outcomes. This is a big deal for the 319 program. One of the things that my board looks for particularly are what are the specific tangible products and outcomes and deliverables that will come out of your project. And again, be specific. We don't want to know that you're going to improve water quality. We assume that. What exactly are you going to improve? What is the environmental benefit? And be product oriented rather than process oriented. So rather than saying, well, we're going to fix animal feeding operations, how are you going to prioritize? What are the concrete, again, tangible deliverables that would resonate with, again, an average citizen in terms of what's going to be produced by this project? Oh, I don't know what happened to my little text box here, but the format got a little wonky there. But anyway, project evaluation is also a very critical part of the 319 program. It's challenging, but it's critical. We are held as a program to environmental measures of success. These get reported to the federal level. Namely, our primary measure of success is restoring impaired water bodies. That's a pretty lofty goal, but it is one that we are achieving. But we are very interested in people allocating time and resources and some of the project funding towards determining, did your project work? Was it effective? And this includes both water quality data or some kind of environmental measure, and it includes evaluating your other activities such as outreach and education. If you're doing tours, if you're doing newsletters, if you're building a new website, are you reaching your target audience and is it being effective? So I want to go into this in a little more detail because it is important. So I want to talk a little bit more about evaluation and monitoring, some considerations if you do monitor, estimating pollutant load reductions, and then BMP operation and maintenance. So let's start with evaluation and monitoring. Again, getting that water quality data, that environmental data is challenging, but it's a very important and I think a very cool part of the 319 program. The graphs there on the screen, these are all data that we've obtained from our 319 project showing environmental improvement. Data carries a powerful message. When we can show this to management, when we can show this to partners, when we can show this to ranchers about, these projects are benefiting multiple resources and they're improving water quality, that carries a strong message. And it's data like this that allows us to then show that a water body is now no longer impaired and get it off the 303D list, which is a huge success. In general, if you are implementing on-the-ground best management practices with your 319 funding, in general, you are required to include a monitoring component to evaluate effectiveness. However, there are some cases where you can make a justification that monitoring would not be an effective use of funds. In that case, go ahead and include in your proposal a justification for why. There's more information in the memorandum for 319 about examples. One example would be maybe you need to do 5 years of BMP implementation before you think it's worth going back out to invest money into monitoring. Maybe there's some situations where in reality it's not safe to monitor and doing some kind of modeling effort would be make more sense. So there are some situations where not monitoring is going to be the best route, but by and large, we are looking for some kind of evaluation component, including water quality monitoring or environmental monitoring as part of your project. And think strategically and creatively about what success looks like for your project. Ultimately, the measure for our projects, if we're working on an impaired water body, is it meeting the standard or not? Making that kind of use support determination may or may not be one of your monitoring objectives under 319. It doesn't have to be, it might be. And it's not the only way to demonstrate success. Think about if you had, at the end of your project, if you had to describe to the public why your project was successful, how would you communicate it to them? And don't underestimate the power of qualitative or semi-quantitative methods. Photo point monitoring is fantastic. The couple pictures there from Little Snake River Conservation District, some before and after photos of a stream that they restored, that tells a powerful message. So don't underestimate photo point monitoring, and don't underestimate some methods such as riparian health indices, where maybe it's a semi-quantitative method to just get an evaluation of how your riparian health is doing from year to year. I personally would really like to see somebody try some more riparian health indices or methods along those lines. Even if you're looking, maybe your pollutant of concern is E. coli and you're doing some off-channel watering, you could do water quality monitoring for E. coli in the stream, but also seeing how your riparian area vegetation improves year to year is just another way to communicate to the public why what you did is successful. So again, think water quality data is good, don't get me wrong, but think big picture. Think about how can you communicate to the public why your project was successful. And again, for information, education activities, outreach, think creatively about how you can gauge whether these activities are effective. I can kind of guarantee you that I have at least one board member that will ask you that if you have a big information education project or component to your project. If I had the answer and how to do that, I would let you know, but we're honestly looking for people to come up with better ways to answer that question. How do we know if information education is being effective? If you do monitor, if you're out there in the stream or collecting some kind of environmental data, again, clearly think through why you are monitoring and state your objectives. Effectiveness monitoring should be one of them. Effectiveness monitoring just being, this is the beginning, this is our baseline data, we implemented these BMPs, were they effective or not? You could have other objectives besides that. You support determination, collecting data to see if a water body is meeting a standard might be one of them, but again, it doesn't have to be. So don't get too hung up on use support unless you're at the stage where you really think you can make a case that you're meeting the water quality standard. Secondly, is it feasible to collect the information you need to meet your objectives? Will the results be conclusive? Is your scale appropriate? Just some other things to think through. We don't want to invest a lot of time and energy and money into monitoring if we're not going to get conclusive data. For example, if your nearest monitoring site is 20 miles downstream of your BMP, it might be the best BMP project in the world, but you're probably not going to detect differences 20 miles downstream. So think strategically. If you do invest monitoring, if you do invest money into monitoring, let's really work together to make sure that what you're doing is going to give you conclusive data. If you do monitor in your proposal, make sure you describe your monitoring strategy, including but not limited to the number and location of sites, sampling frequency and timing, parameters, methods, QA/QC, sampler qualifications, etc. If you do monitor, note that a sampling and analysis plan will be required along with the quality assurance project plan. These will need to be submitted to DEQ and approved by DEQ before you begin sampling, but you do not need to have these ready with your proposal. Also note that any data collected at the end of the project does need to be reported electronically to DEQ. And finally, make sure that you are familiar with two Wyoming statutes. The first, trespassing to collect data. Secondly, the Wyoming Public Records Act. Again, if you're out there collecting data, just make sure that you understand what you need to do to collect, get permissions to be on private property. And the Public Records Act, please realize again that these are federal funds. Any information submitted to me as part of the project are open to the public. So make sure that you understand the Wyoming Public Records Act. And again, you're getting permissions if you need to. Estimating pollutant load reductions. So this is something that I think could probably be its own webinar on its own. It's a big topic. The reason, again, that we estimate pollutant load reductions as part of the 319 program is that we're required to. Every state, tribe, or territory that gets 319 funds each year is required to report how much sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus we think we've reduced through 319 funds to the federal level. Those numbers go to Congress. It's just one of the metrics for a program. When it goes to that level, it's aggregated as a national sum. So it's not like it gets reported project by project. It just gets totaled up across all of the states, tribes, and territories, and those totals get presented to Congress. But that is why in the history of the 319 program, I ask people in their final project reports, if you implement BMPs, you'll be required to estimate pollutant load reductions. But including that information up front in your proposal is one way to communicate to the task force what the measurable, tangible outcomes of your project are. And it really communicates that you've thought through what the benefits are. It might help you prioritize where you do your BMPs. So it is something to look into. Ideally, we estimate pollutant load reductions on water quality data. That's kind of in an ideal world. We don't always have the data to do that. So in other cases, we can use modeling or other methods to come up with some pollutant load reduction estimates. I get asked a lot about what modeling tools are available. There are a lot out there. And again, that's why I think this could be its whole separate webinar. The first that I would direct your attention to is one called the spreadsheet tool for estimating pollutant load, more commonly referred to as STEP-L. It's a model that was put together by Tetra Tech for EPA, and it just employs algorithms to calculate nutrient sediment loads from different land uses and the load reductions that would result from the implementation of various BMPs. They have made some pretty cool updates to STEP-L in recent years. I would encourage you to look into this if you are going to be implementing BMPs. If you use that link there, you'll come up to the STEP-L page. In particular, look for the training webinar that was offered in March 2018. It's a very good overview of that model. It'll walk you through it, how you can use it, whether to calculate estimates after you've implemented BMPs, or if you want to plan out different scenarios in your watershed. It's a pretty powerful tool to be able to say, well, if we did this, we would get this load reduction. If we did a different scenario, we would get this load reduction. So if you are interested in looking into this model, please watch that webinar. I think it's a very good overview. For stream restoration projects, a lot of the tools that we get for evaluating success would be, doing cross sections before and after, as-built surveys. If you're interested in fisheries, talk with Game and Fish to see if they have any fish survey population data that they could contribute to your project to get a before and after picture. There's several Roskin methods out there that are commonly used, Banks, Beehi, and near-bank stress. Some of our monitoring folks could give you more information about that, or if you're doing a stream restoration project and you've got Game and Fish folks involved, they can give you more information on those methods as well. Just some other ideas that I run across commonly in our projects. A lot of people work with their NRCS staff on runoff equations and then making assumptions about pollutant concentrations to come up with load reduction estimates. Some people just do surveys year to year. So if they've constructed a sediment basin, they just go out and survey it each year to see how much sediment is captured each year. If you're working in an urban environment, oftentimes there are engineering equations that can be used to model pollutant concentrations and loads coming off urban areas. Sometimes it's as simple as dredging and weighing. And then finally, if you're doing septic systems, I do have a very simple spreadsheet model that you are welcome to. I would be happy to send that to you if you are interested. BMP operation and maintenance is another important topic. In your proposal in the evaluation section, be sure to briefly describe how you will commit to BMP operation and maintenance. We want to make sure that we don't spend money on BMPs and then it's just kind of a fix it and forget about it approach. We do want to make sure that those BMPs are operating and they are being effective for a reasonable lifespan of the practice. In the past, I've offered bonus points for people to do what we call BMP follow-up monitoring, which is simply, 1, 2, 3 years after you implement a BMP that you take some time and you go back out and you do a qualitative assessment of whether or not that BMP was implemented as planned and whether or not it's being effective. We will not be doing the bonus points for that this year. but I still strongly encourage that you consider doing that. You can see the guidance that has been revised, posted up on the website. It's pretty simple, but again, it carries a lot of weight with me for people when they take the time to go back out and make sure that the projects are being effective. I mentioned earlier that partnerships are key, and they are. They're one of the most heavily weighted evaluation criteria for our proposals. In this section of the application form, so we've switched back to the application form pages. Under the partnerships table, list your partners and contributions. And this includes technical and financial contributions. Again, these are key. We really are looking to see if you brought all the right people to the table. Are you actively looking for other funding sources? My board they will notice if you've done your homework and are out there actively looking for other funding sources, or if you're just relying on 319 funds for the bulk of your funding. Again, partners include those that are contributing services and those that are contributing financial contributions. So landowners that are contributing their time, volunteers that are contributing their time, people contributing equipment, those are all partnerships to note, not just cash contributions. Really, the board members in the past, they want to know that anybody with skin in the game is kicking into the project, that they are contributing in some way or another. Outreach and education, most projects should have some kind of outreach and education component. It doesn't have to be big, but how can you get the word out about your project and improving water quality? How can you encourage others to be involved? And again, be creative, learn from the past. If you've tried tours in the past and they haven't been working, try something else. If your newsletters have gotten a lot of good feedback, continue doing those. But we are, again, just interested that you are stopping to evaluate what is and is not working. Next page, past project history. Oops, let's see here. Here we're just looking for if you've had past experience with the program, whether 205J or 319 projects, please just identify those. Give us a brief history. If you have not sponsored a past project through our program, describe any experience that you have with grants management. Overall, we're just looking for confidence that you have the ability to manage the grant funds. Sage grouse core area. So in regards to sage grouse core area protection, the DEQ has a memorandum of agreement with Game and Fish about some actions that we'll take to make sure we're working together to protect sage grouse core area. You can refer to the 319 memo for full explanation, but basically, if you have a project that will have land disturbing activity in a sage grouse core area, you'll need to obtain a consultation letter from Game and Fish and include that with your proposal. If you're not sure if you're in a core area, take a look at that Game and Fish data website. There's a link from my website there that'll provide maps of core areas, or I'm sure you can also call Game and Fish sage grouse folks for more information. Make sure that you contact Game and Fish well in advance. I wouldn't wait until the last minute and expect them to turn around a letter in just a few days. If you're in a core area and you think you might need one, I'd go ahead and start reaching out to them now. If your project is not in a core area, or if you won't have any land disturbing activities, just check either of the second boxes there and you're good to go. You don't need to submit a consultation letter. But again, based on our agreements with Game and Fish, if you do need a consultation letter, it absolutely has to be included with the proposal. Otherwise, I will not be able to accept your proposal. Other information, finally, the last kind of catch-all section, just give us any other information that you want to tell us about your project that we didn't get in the rest of the application. What else do you think is important for us to know about your project? Open-ended, each project's unique, so just use that section for anything that might have been missed in the rest of the application. There are a few special considerations. If you're doing some irrigation best management practices, such as pivot systems, please read through requirements in that memorandum. Same with septic systems. We can rehabilitate some failing septic systems, but there are some very specific eligibility criteria also posted on the website. Direct link there. If you have any questions about those eligibility criteria, feel free to give me a call. And finally, We've outlined some specific considerations. If you're doing microbial source tracking, again, take a look at either the 319 and 205J memorandums for specific information that we will need if you're proposing to do MST sampling. Okay, the budget. Here is the second area where I think there's the biggest streamlining from the past. In the past, I had that budget Excel workbook that needed to be completed. We've simplified that greatly this year. So the first part of the budget is just providing a summary on this page. Line A is simply how much money are you asking for from DEQ? This will be the amount of 319 funds you're asking for. Line B is how much non-federal match will you provide? As a reminder, 40% of your total project cost has to be non-federal match. Line C is just adding A and B. Line D, other federal funds contribution. You are not required to have other federal funding, but if you do, such as say NRCS funding or staff time, BLM funding or staff time, Forest Service funding or staff time, it's really good to note it. It just, especially with the amount of federal lands in Wyoming, helps capture when those federal agencies are contributing to watershed restoration, watershed protection efforts. So you're not required to have anything here, but if you do know that there will be a federal contribution to your project, it's good to list it there. And then finally, line E is just summing C and D above. Let's talk a little bit more about non-federal match. So again, key being non-federal, it has to come from a state source, a private fund source, or landowner contributions. Non-federal match can be cash or in kind. Cash obviously would be like another state grant source, such as Department of Ag, Water Development, private cash funds towards the project. In kind are your volunteer services where there's a contribution to the project, but there's no cash transaction. So a landowner contributing their time, a landowner contributing their equipment, a team of volunteers that comes out and does a stream cleanup, all of that would be your in-kind service. If you have questions about which is which, please let me know. The non-federal match must be accrued during the same time frame that your 319 project is active, plus there's a 60-day look-back window, meaning that if you did planning for your project a year ago under a non-federal source, we can't count that as match towards the project. It has to be match that's accrued during the same time that your project is active with 319 funds plus up to 60 days prior. So just keep that in mind as you're planning. I think that's caused some confusion in the past when I get proposals. Again, at least 40% of your total project cost must be non-federal match. In the simplest example there, if you know your total project cost is going to be $100,000, 60,000 of that could be 319 funds, 60%, 40,000 of that could be your non-federal match, 40%. In terms of calculating this, one tip that I give people, the other way to quickly calculate what your minimum 40% non-federal match is, take the amount of requested 319 funds and divide that by 1.5. So in the previous example, if you know you want to ask us for 60,000 in 319 funds, divided by 1.5, that'll give you your 40% non-federal match. So just another way to get to the same information. Couple websites that might help you out. The Bureau of Labor Statistics gives occupational employment salaries for various positions. If you're looking for how to capture somebody's contributions to the project, say you've got a hydrologist that's contributing some time pro bono to your project and you want to know how much to charge, you can look what the current as of May 2017 occupational salary is for that position. The value of volunteer time, I've gone off this website, the Independent Sector, which establishes the current national volunteer hourly rate. Right now it's $24.69. If you've got volunteer time for your project, you can use that hourly rate for your volunteers. The next part of the budget in the proposal form is a simplified budget justification. And again, we're looking for very brief information this year in the proposal. In this page, you'll want to, by the different cost categories, being the personnel / labor, supplies / equipment, contractual, other, those cost categories there, you'll want to break out your project cost by 319 funds, not federal match, and any other federal funds. What what sub-costs you have for each cost category and where that funding is coming from. Are you going to use 319 funds for it, or are you going to use non-federal match funds? And then finally, in the last column, provide a brief description of what the major expenses are for each category. If you're going to use non-federal funds, briefly describe the source of those funds. Is it Department of Ag, Water Development, Natural Resource Trust, in-kind match, etc. If you have any equipment purchases, we'll need to talk about those before they can be approved. Just note that for purposes of our grants, equipment is personal property with lifespan of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. We don't typically see equipment purchases. If you're just purchasing some minor monitoring supplies and equipment, that doesn't count. It has to be a pretty significant piece of equipment, $5,000 or more, lifespan of more than 1 year. So if you think you've got equipment and you have any questions, feel free to give me a call on that. This is more just a heads up rather than anything you need to worry about in your budget or budget justification. But just realize that if you are recommended for funding, there are limits on the administrative costs that we can charge towards the project. If you are recommended for funding, we'll work with you to more fully outline project tasks and a budget justification. The first task will be administration, i.e. time that the sponsor spends managing the grant, reporting, tracking the budget, indirect costs, etc. We can pay for those costs, but they are limited to 10% of the 319 award and 10% of the total project costs. So I don't want to go through this in too much detail, but just note for planning purposes that we can pay for some administrative costs, but they are limited to 10% of your federal award, 10% of your total project cost. Last page is the certification and signature page. These are just things that I want to make sure that before you submit a proposal, you are aware of, and that we're on the same page, that you understand that these are some of the requirements associated with the program. I'm not going to go through these one by one. I think most of them we've kind of hit on throughout the rest of the webinar, but please check the boxes and indicate that you understand those various statements. If there's any that you don't understand or aren't making sense, feel free to give me a call if you're not comfortable checking off and signing. After you've checked the boxes, please sign and date. For the hard copies, only one copy needs to have the original signature. I'll get into this as well. I'll also need an electronic copy. The electronic copy does not need to be signed. Okay. So 319 was kind of the bulk of it. So let's take another break. It does not look like any questions have come in via chat. I'll open it up to the phone lines. If anybody wants to take themselves off mute and ask any questions, please go ahead. Okay, hearing none. Hopefully everything is clear as mud and it's making perfect sense to everybody. I'm hoping that's the case. So, okay, not hearing any questions. Oh, great, thanks, Kristen. Not hearing any questions, we'll keep moving forward. We'll talk about 205J proposals next. This should be pretty simple. A lot of the same guidance that we just covered for 319 applies to 205J as well. But I do want to hit on some key points regarding 205J. Again, this is our smaller grant, water quality management planning only. We can't do on-the-ground work. So things like watershed planning, monitoring, assessment, feasibility studies, BMP design projects, all of those are potential projects for 205J. Unlike 319, we've got some more specific eligibility for who can apply. Only local planning agencies can apply for 205J. In Wyoming, those are cities, counties, towns, and conservation districts. So you can partner with other groups, but one of those entities would have to sponsor the project. We've got $40,000 available for projects each year. That's pretty set in stone. It's unlikely that we would get more or less year to year, just based on what's in the Clean Water Act. And here again, we can't use it for anything that's related to an enforcement or permit or regulatory action. We are placing the highest priority again on impaired water bodies, but we've had lots of 205J projects on unimpaired water bodies. So impairments are a priority, but just depending on what proposals we get, we've had a lot of competitive projects on unimpaired water bodies too. This is also a reimbursement only grant. For this grant, a minimum of 25% of total project costs must be non-federal match. So 319 is 40%, 205J is 25%. So what do you need to submit for a 205J proposal? For 205J, just simply the application form and one or more project maps. Here again, not looking for any other attachments. You do not need the Excel budget workbook, and you do not need to submit letters of support. If you are recommended for funding, again, though, we will work with you to put together a more detailed project implementation plan and budget justification. The application form, very similar to 319. It's a fillable PDF form, only 7 pages. All of the other same guidance applies. Again, make sure you download it and save it to your computer first before you open it, and try to edit and save it. Going through the pages, the first page is very similar to 319. Refer to the same guidance there. The only thing that I'll call to your attention, oops. Oh, nope, that's on the second page. Yeah, so first page, refer to 319 guidance. Second page, very similar to 319 guidance as well. The one thing that I will call to your attention is the time frame. 205J projects are shorter, 2 years maximum. So any 205J projects for FY19 would need to be completed by September 30th of 2021. Next page, same guidance as the 319 proposal, with an emphasis under outcomes in terms of one of the key aspects of 205J projects is really making it clear what you will do with the monitoring, the data, the assessment, the planning work that you spend 205J funds on. In other words, we want to avoid projects where we, for example, monitor for monitoring's sake, where we might get a bunch of really good data, but there's really no purpose to it. My board members have been very interested in making sure that there is a next step following the 205J project, that there is some commitment to use that data, to do the next step, to get to on-the-ground implementation, to some way get to water quality improvement. So if I had to stress the most important thing about 205J projects, that would be it. Next page, monitoring, project history, and other information. Refer to the same guidance as the 319 proposal. Clearly think through your monitoring objectives, and here again, like we talked about in 319, why are you monitoring and what are you going to do with that information? Use support might be one of your objectives, but it doesn't have to be. Maybe it's getting baseline data, maybe it's doing some effectiveness monitoring, maybe you need some more data to identify sources. Be clear on why you're monitoring, and again, try to avoid monitoring for monitoring's sake. Budget for 205J, very similar. Refer to the 319 guidance for kind of the take-home messages. And here again, note that only 25% of total project costs must be non-federal match. And with the tip here is you can either start with your total project cost and break it out into 75, 25, or if you know how much 205J funding you want to request, divide that amount by 3. That'll give you your 75-25 split. So in this example, if you apply for the full $40,000 of 205J funds, you divide that by 3, that'll give you $13,333. That's your 25% non-federal match for a total project cost of $53,333. And for the budget justification, same guidance, break it out into those cost categories, the source of the funding, and a very brief description of your major costs. The same 10% limits on administrative costs here apply. If you're recommended for funding, we'll work with you to make sure that all of that's ironed out in your project plan. Same certification page, same rules about signature. Again, give me a call if you have any questions about what I'm asking you to check the box off on. Okay, 205J was pretty brief. Any questions specifically about 205J? Didn't look like anything else came in. I'll open up the lines. Anybody that wants to chime in? Okay, hearing none, we'll go through the last section, which is really just talking about how to submit your proposal and what the next steps are. So giving an overview of the instructions that are also in the memorandum. To submit your proposal, first make 14 hard copies of your application packet. For 319, that will include the application form, one or more maps, and if applicable, that sage-grouse consultation letter from Game and Fish. For 205J, just the application form and the maps. 205J projects, because they're not doing any land disturbing activity, you won't need to do a sage-grouse consultation letter, whether or not you're in a core area or not. Again, please no other attachments. My board members have really emphasized over the years to keep it simple. Providing more paper has not really made a positive impact on them in the past. So keep it simple. If there's questions or we need clarifying information, I'll let you know. The maps, please print those in color if applicable, but everything else please print in black and white. Only one of the hard copies needs to have an original signature. The rest can just be Xeroxed copies. Please staple each packet together. Don't use other covers or bindings. The staples really just make my life simpler in terms of sorting and organizing. And then to submit your proposal, mail, by mail I mean postmark, or hand deliver the hard copies to my attention by 5 p.m. close of business on September 14th. My address is in those memorandums. Again, they don't have to be in my office, they just have to be postmarked by that date, or if you're in town and you want to run them by my office, you're welcome to do that too. And then secondly, please email me the electronic copy of the packet by the same deadline, 5 p.m. September 14th. The electronic copy does not need to have a signature. Please convert documents to PDF format. You can combine them if you want, or you can email them as separate documents, but PDF documents will make my life much, much easier. When I get your applications, I will send you a confirmation email. And after that, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, I'll review the proposals here at DEQ, and I will draft up comments on each proposal. The proposals and my comments on each proposal will then get mailed to the members of the task force. And I probably should have specified this earlier. If you're not familiar with who the task force is, they're a board of 13 citizens that have been appointed by the governor to oversee my program. They've got a lot of functions. They provide me with general direction and oversight, and they are also the board that makes the funding recommendations for projects. If you want to see who's currently on the board, you can go to my website. There's a program resource for task force, and then a table posted that shows who the current members are. Once I draft up my comments, the comments that go to the task force, I will also send a copy of those comments back to you, the sponsor. And all of the sponsors that have submitted a proposal will have the opportunity to present their project to the task force at the fall 2018. Again, the date and location of which is to be determined. But typically it'll be middle of October to early November, that time frame. For 319 proposals, the task force will use an evaluation form and scoring sheet to score each proposal, and that includes your written proposal plus the presentation. I get questions about the presentations, and really think of it, it's an opportunity to explain to the board firsthand, in person, why your project is important and should be funded. The presentation should provide an overview of your project, and it should provide any further information needed to fill in the gaps. At times, the board may ask pretty technical questions, so if you're not the technical person for your project, then I would strongly recommend that you bring somebody that can answer those technical questions in. That might be your NRCS DC, it could be somebody from a partnering agency, but please make sure you have somebody there who can answer those technical questions. My board members also asked me to convey that even though we're using a shortened, streamlined application form this year, it doesn't mean that there's a lower bar for what's included in the proposals. They have really appreciated over the last few years that the quality of proposals has steadily increased. They want to maintain that quality while acknowledging people's time that they spend on these proposals. So make sure in the presentation that if there's any information that you weren't able to put into your proposal that you think is important for the board to know, that you present that as part of your presentation to the task force. At that meeting, the fall task force meeting, the board will recommend funding to projects. If you are recommended for funding, I will work with you to put together that more detailed project plan and the budget and justification. And then it's a bit of a waiting game until the federal budget's approved and the funds are released to the state in the next spring or summer. At that point, I'll work with each sponsor to set up the legal agreement that basically says we're providing you X amount of funding to do this kind of work. Please note that the project is not active until we have that signed agreement in place. This is just a screenshot of that Section 319 project evaluation form. This first page is simply summarizing some key project information, my general comments, and then pay attention to this additional information requested from the sponsor. If I see anything in your proposal where it's like, hey, my board's going to ask you this, or we could really stand to have more information on this subject, I'll put specific items here or questions here for you to include in your presentation. My board definitely pays attention to this section. They get frustrated when I ask for more information and it's not presented. So please take a look at this section and make sure you read through it. The second page is the scoring form that the task force will fill out for each 319 proposal. The scoring sheet is intended to guide discussion. It is not the final decision-making tool, but it does heavily influence where the discussion goes, how they look at overall projects. So just as if you're studying for a test, this is kind of what you're going to be graded on. Take a look at what the project, how heavily weighted each criterion is. That might give you some indicators on where to make sure you completely covered what your project will entail. These are the evaluation criteria written out. I won't go over these in detail, but I wanted to kind of highlight the weights. The two most heavily weighted criterion are the water quality need. Why is this an important project for the state of Wyoming? And who are the project partners? Again, they really want to make sure that all the appropriate people have been brought to the table to make the project successful. Kind of your medium weights are, have you done enough planning to make this project successful? Have you done your homework? What are your measurable outcomes? Are your costs reasonable? And do you have a method to evaluate project effectiveness? Those are also very important criteria. And the other, I don't want to say they're not important, but the lower weight criteria would be, do you have a good outreach education plan? Do you have sufficient technical and managerial resources? Is your project going to be long-term and self-maintaining rather than just a Band-Aid fix? Is your project timely and efficient? And to the extent possible, will it benefit other resources? Again, we have to focus on the water quality benefit for our funds, but we hope that projects are designed in such a manner that they also benefit wildlife or fisheries, soil health, water conservation. So make sure that in your proposal you describe what other benefits there are to your project. And for any of our 319 projects, I think there are always multiple benefits. So spend some time thinking about that. Those scoring criteria, again, are available on that website. There's a second document, the proposal review guidelines, that go hand in hand with those evaluation criteria that just provide a few more questions to get the task force thinking along the lines of what we're looking for each criterion. 205J evaluation, we do not have an evaluation form or scoring form, rather. You will receive an evaluation form from me, which just has the summarized project information and my comments and any additional information requested. So again, if I request any additional information, please be sure to look at that. Again, no numeric scoring form for 205J. We will generally evaluate those proposals to determine if the project is reasonable and attainable. Can you achieve your project outcomes, objectives, and tasks? And the more that you can demonstrate that the products are efficient and effective use of funds to address non-point source pollution planning and assessment, the better chance you will have of securing funding. Again, with 205J focus, what are you going to do with that information? Is there a commitment to follow up with some kind of implementation or improvement? If you're not familiar with the program and you want to get a sense of what projects we've funded in the past, you can go to this website. There's a story map which shows recent or currently active projects, minus last year's. I haven't posted those yet, but that'll give you an idea of some of the projects around the state that have been funded. Also on that same website, there are some final reports posted from recently closed projects that might give you some additional context in terms of what projects have done in the past, what their budgets have been, how they've presented their projects, etc. So that's it. That's what I've got. Thank you again for attending. I hope that that covered what people need to put together a proposal. Again, if you have questions about technical aspects, watershed planning, procedures, don't hesitate to give me a call. I'm more than happy to answer those questions. What I cannot do from this point forward is review any content, provide comments, help plan projects, etc. So I don't think we've had any more comments or questions come in via chat. You've made my life easy today. So, oh, looks like one has come in. Can you read that stuff?
Yeah, link to the recording.
Yes, so after the webinar today, I will post the recording to the website. I don't know exactly where. What I will do is send out a notice through that same listserv where the RFP notice came out, letting people know where exactly the recording has been posted. If you're not able to find it, please give me a call. My number's there on the screen, and I'll send you a link to where you can find the recording. It'll probably take me several days before I can post it, but I'll let you know once it's available. Great. Any other questions via chat, or the phone lines are open. Please feel free to shout it out if you've got a question. Now would be the time if you've got specific questions about your project that you might be planning. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, and I'm seeing people leave the meeting, so I'm assuming people are in a good spot. Thank you again for your time and attention, and thank you for your interest in our grant programs, and I very much look forward to getting proposals this year. Thank you.